Today's video discusses harsh topics like kidnapping, torture, rape, and death. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. On one cold winter evening in 1979, a happy-go-lucky young woman was being thrown a surprise party that would end in her death. How could more than 20 people take the life of one young woman and not tell a soul for almost 30 years? How could no one speak out and do the right thing? In the spring of 2003, Dr. David Schock, an associate professor at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, was leading a class discussion on how investigative reporters can work with police to get the facts to the public without harming an investigation. Dr. Schock had Captain Bob DeVries in to help aid in the discussion. At the end of the discussion, the captain said that he was retiring. So Dr. Schock thanked him and then asked him, what was the one case in your career that was considered the one that got away? Captain DeVries didn't even blink, and he instantly said the Janet Chandler case. Dr. Schock said that the 25-year-old unsolved crime really called to him. So in the fall of 2003, in the fall term, Dr. Schock proposed to his documentary class the story and the crime of Janet Chandler. The students agreed and were ready to get started on making a documentary based on Janet Chandler, at which Dr. Schock obtained permission from Janet's parents before pursuing the project. Then Dr. Schock and his students got to work. They interviewed the investigators that were involved, Janet's family, and anyone else affected by her murder. One person the students wanted to interview was Janet's best friend, Lori, but they couldn't figure out why Janet's friend would vanish after her best friend's death. This tidbit of information was a huge red flag in the students' research for their film. The students finished their film and they titled it, Who Killed Janet Chandler? Their documentary premiered in January 2004 at the Knickerbocker Theater in Holland, Michigan. Police had hoped that the film would spark new interest in the case and that the case would be reopened. Janet Chandler was born May 29, 1956, in Muskegon County, Michigan, to Glenna and James Chandler. She had two brothers and grew up in a conservative Christian home, and she herself was a devout Christian. When Janet was younger, she went on mission trips, sang in the church choir, and worked at a daycare center. Janet's mother described her daughter as easygoing, but also sheltered. She was not allowed to go to sleepovers at people's houses where the adults consumed alcohol. Her teachers would describe her as an emotionally sensitive girl who would run out of the class crying if she was criticized. After high school, Janet attended Muskegon Community College to major in nursing, but later transferred to Hope College, a Christian liberal arts college. Janet wanted to earn a bachelor's degree in vocal education, become a music teacher, and ultimately an opera singer because she had a beautiful mezzo-soprano voice. Once attending Hope College in Holland, she lived in an off-campus apartment with her best friend and co-worker/boss, Lori Swank. Janet worked at the Blue Mill Inn as a night clerk on the edge of town in the winter of 1978. In the winter of 1978, Chemtron, a local paint plant, had 200 union workers walk out and go on strike. Teamster organizers brought in experienced strikers from Detroit to help bulk up the picket line. In return, Chemtron hired Wackenhut, a security company, to keep the gates open for the scabs, or strikebreakers. Scabs are people that choose to not walk the picket line and continue to work. Picketers would taunt the guards at the gates and vice versa. It said that the guards would put nails under the tires of people that were picketing. It was a very tense and volatile situation. After work, the security guards would let loose at the Blue Mill Inn, where more than 80 guards were staying during the strike. The guards liked to hook up with the motel staff, and Janet was allegedly one of them, as well as Lori Swank, Janet's boss. One day, Lori yelled at Janet for apparently having sex with her boyfriend, lead security guard Arthur Paiva, in one of the motel rooms at the Blue Mill Inn. Another night Janet was working her shift, one of the motel maids, Cheryl Ruiz, accused Janet of sleeping with her boyfriend, another one of the security guards. Allegedly, Janet had called Cheryl's boyfriend's room and asked him to meet her at the front desk. There, Janet stood nude waiting for him and then slept with him in one of the motel rooms. Arthur Paiva, Lori Swank, and Cheryl Ruiz had had enough of Janet and her behavior, and Arthur Paiva reportedly said he wanted to take Janet down a few notches, which was unusual since Arthur had also apparently slept with Janet. After Arthur had made the plan to humiliate Janet, on January 31st, he had another security guard, Robert Lynch, lure Janet away from the front desk and made it look like the front desk had been robbed. He left a lit cigarette burning in the ashtray and took $500 from the safe. Robert Lynch then called the Holland Police Department at around 2 a.m. and said he was staying at the Blue Mill Inn. He was pretending to be a guest there, and he said that he had heard what he thought was a robbery taking place in the lobby. But instead, there was no robbery taking place. Robert Lynch approached Janet working that night and said the guards were throwing her a surprise party in her honor. He wrapped gauze around her eyes and then wrapped duct tape around her eyes, and Janet complied. Janet was then taken to a guest house that was on Lake Makatawa, and it was owned by the Chemtron paint plant. This is where the lead guard, Arthur Paiva, was staying. Robert led Janet inside the house, and it was inside that she was forcibly stripped of her clothes, gagged, and then handcuffed. Janet was paraded around nude while still blindfolded, gagged, and handcuffed. She was teased and taunted by more than 20 people, which consisted of Wackenhut security guards and 6 employees of the Blue Mill Inn. They partied, drank, and hollered all around her. For the next 17 hours, Janet was humiliated, beaten, tortured, and gang raped. Someone put a belt around her neck and cinched it tight. This was used to control Janet's actions. Then Janet was tied to a bed where at least 12 different men raped and beat her. While the different men raped her, others around her would cheer and holler. Among those cheering was her best friend Lori Swank and the Blue Mill Inn maid Cheryl Ruiz. Lori called Janet names and screamed that Janet was getting what she deserved. Arthur Paiva stood by as the ringleader and had other people take pictures of everything. Not for souvenirs, though, but for collateral. He wanted to use the pictures as blackmail to keep people quiet so that they wouldn't get caught. Robert Lynch was the one that ended her life. While he raped her, he used the belt to strangle her until she passed away. When everyone realized that Janet was dead, they all panicked. The consensus was that Janet's life would end that night, but when it actually happened, people got nervous. They cleaned Janet's body completely and dumped her in a snowbank 40 miles away. At 1 a.m. the next day, a snowplow truck driver was out on Highway 196 and noticed fresh tire tracks that crossed the median in the road. He followed the tire tracks. They went into the woods and ended at a snowdrift. The driver saw an arm and a nude torso sticking out of the snow. It was Janet. At Janet's funeral, Lori Swank was in attendance, but after the funeral, she promptly moved away. 2 weeks later, the strike ended at Chemtron. All the other security guards went home and just lived their lives. Meanwhile, Janet's parents were without their only daughter, and her case went cold. It would be 20 years later in a documentary film created by Hope College students that had hopes of solving her murder that would bring the case back to life. Like I said earlier, the film in fact did spark new interest. The Michigan State Police and Holland Police formed a cold case team and started their investigation. Lori Swank was found living in Pennsylvania, and they also found Robert Lynch. He was an older security guard that police thought would be helpful. He was living with his wife in Three Oaks, Michigan, about 80 miles away from Holland. He had a grown son and daughter, and he had opened a successful beauty school for his wife. At first, he didn't want to talk to police, but police noticed something about him. Robert seemingly had a perfect life, but he was a severe alcoholic. Police couldn't figure out why someone like him would have such an awful drinking problem. When Robert finally started answering questions, he had said that he slept with Janet a few times, and that the night that Janet disappeared, she was at a party where a few guards were at, and it went haywire. But then Robert stopped talking. This shocked investigators, because in all the years of questioning people, no one ever mentioned any type of party. Over the next 3 months, investigators tried to get more information from Robert. Then one day, police showed Robert a segment from the student's documentary of Janet's parents crying and saying they hope they do not die, not knowing whatever happened to their daughter. Police asked Robert what he would want if this had happened to his daughter. Then Robert Lynch broke, and he told them everything. 27 years after Janet's murder, Robert Lynch was arrested on the grounds of first-degree murder. Shortly after, 5 more arrests were made. Lori Swank of Pennsylvania, James Nelson and Freddie Parker of West Virginia, Anthony Williams of Wisconsin, and Arthur Paiva of Michigan. Robert Lynch pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 to 40 years in prison. Lori Swank pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Robert and Lori agreed to testify against the 4 other men in exchange for lighter sentences. Freddie Parker, James Nelson, and Anthony Williams were found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Arthur Paiva, the one who ordered the pictures to be taken, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. And I do want to make a mention here that those pictures have never been found. In 2013, Arthur Paiva died in prison at the age of 61 after only serving 5 years. James Nelson died in prison in 2021. Freddie Parker was discharged from prison in 2021, and if you look online, it shows the state discharged him, and they do not give an explanation why. Upon further research, I did find that Freddie Parker died in October 2021, so it's most likely he was discharged due to health reasons. I'm not sure why, but sometimes prisoners are discharged when they are extremely old or extremely sick for whatever reason. But like I said, upon my further research, I couldn't find anything on that. Lori Swank was paroled in 2016, and she moved back to Pennsylvania. At the sentencing hearing, James Chandler said this: "Your Honor, my name is James Chandler. Glenna and I have been waiting 28 years for this day. They thought they got away with it, and for the most part, they did." He also said, "You would have thought, well, what can they say? They all say they weren't there, and they're innocent. As a Christian, I just say we should probably forgive. However, you have to ask for forgiveness, and none of these arrogant people show remorse, much less ask for forgiveness." Then Glenna said, "I do feel sorry for the parents and the families of the men. I can't feel sorry for the men. I can't hate them. because that would make me like them. The Chandlers then thanked all the investigators and court personnel for all their hard work. So this is one of those cases where I want to add some final thoughts. I just read through the facts and the information to you about the Janet Chandler case, but I really wanted to put in some thoughts at the end and maybe a little bit of opinion. First, I want to say I think James and Glenna Chandler are extremely kind, gracious, and selfless people, and they are much bigger people than I could ever be in this type of instance because I am a tiger mother. But going through all of the different information and research that I found on Janet Chandler, there were things that I come across that most likely aren't important to address. I've seen different things online where she was possibly promiscuous or had affairs with people, and we don't know if those things are true, and it doesn't really matter if she was or not. What I do think, in after researching Janet, I do think she was a very kind person and a very sweet person, and that probably come off as flirtatious. There are people in this world, and I am one of them, where I come off as flirtatious sometimes, and I really am not meaning to. So I think Janet was like that also. But I really think that she just come off as flirtatious, and the other women that worked at the Blue Mill Inn were jealous. Do I think she did all these sexual things at the hotel with all these guards? Personally, no, I don't think she did. And that's my opinion, and I'll stick to that opinion. But I do think that she was overly nice and it was taken wrong. And I think her friends, Lori and Cheryl, that worked at the Blue Mill Inn were extremely jealous and they wanted to basically get back at her. And they went to Arthur Paiva and it turned into what it did. And it was a hive mind situation. And that's really what I think happened. So I really want to know what your thoughts are. Do you think Janet was this promiscuous person, or do you think she was a nice person and the women that worked at the Blue Mill Inn were just jealous and vindictive? So let me know your thoughts down below, guys. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you soon. If you or anyone you know has been sexually assaulted or abused, you can reach out to RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. You can call them at 1-800-656-4673. If you search RAIN on Google, there's also an online chat option available. Reach out, help is there.